And you're listening to the Brown Perspective. This is Eduardo, and I'm here with my comrade RO.
Hello, hello. What's going on?
Are you worried, man? Are you worried about the start of World War III?
Not really. Yeah, I don't think it's gonna happen.
So you think he's just playing mind games with NATO? And I think, and as you get ready to answer that, it's funny because in some respects, and I know this has been communicated, and I've heard this before, but obviously when you think about it, they're trying to protect their former territory, right? So very similar to how the U.S. reacts when Russia, China, or any other superpower tries to come into the Americas. I think Russia's trying to keep its area clear of any competition.
Yeah, and you already know how I feel about listening to American mainstream media, which I listen to it, but not exclusively. So I'm not surprised that people that listen to just MSNBC, CNN would think that, oh, look at these aggressive Russians. They just want to attack Ukraine because Putin is power hungry and Trump is his puppet and so forth and so forth. But they never really give you the full picture, and you have to really go out there and try to get it on your own. Obviously, Western media is not going to present NATO as an aggressor. It's inconceivable for Americans to think, oh, wait, what? NATO could be acting aggressively towards Russia, and this could be a response. This could be Russia responding to aggression from NATO. I mean, what if it is that? What if that is the case? Would that
Well, it
change
wasn't
your?
NATO who went into Ukraine and took Crimea, though.
Well, but that was a referendum, wasn't it?
Uh-uh.
That wasn't that the people choosing to secede and join.
No, I think that's pretty contested. That's like saying that somebody, the Russians or China, would come in and help Puerto Rico get independence because a percentage of the population there wants independence.
Hmm. But to paint it as simply Russia being power hungry, I think that it just omits the entire other side. Now, I'm not someone that's going to sit here and pretend like Russia doesn't have regional ambitions. They do. So do
Of
we.
course.
So if we have our own ambitions, I mean, Latin America's our backyard. We're sailing our navy ships through the South China Sea, under the pretense of freedom of movement, freedom of navigation. We have military bases in just about every country in the world. So definitely we have our sphere of influence. Russia wants theirs, right? So it's in our interest to block them from doing that. But to portray it as Russia being power hungry when they're doing exactly what we do, but to a lesser degree. And this is me going along with the narrative that Russia did annex Crimea, that it's not more nuanced than that. That's just me saying that, this is me saying that, yeah, Russia has long term plans for their relationship with Ukraine. That doesn't mean that NATO, that European countries and the United States does not act in an aggressive manner towards Russia to try to provoke it, because there's a lot for us to gain from this as well. For if
Well,
Russia,
well, on that point, I think it sounds like folks in the Ukraine have been wanting to join NATO for quite some time now, and it's been the West who has, or the alliance that has not accepted them because I think they know that it could be seen as a provocation to the Russians.
well, yeah, and Russia has always said that that's their red line, that they didn't want NATO expansion after the Iron Curtain came down. The agreement worked out at the time was that NATO would not expand to the east, except NATO has kept expanding. So it has been NATO that has been aggressively expanding closer and closer towards Russia's borders. I read today that the U.S. has a missile defense system. I believe it's Poland, and this is just me looking at it objectively. So I don't like the label like Russian apologist or a commie or defending Russia. I don't know what term they're using for people that want to take a more nuanced view to this. But the situation for Russia is that the more countries that join NATO, the bigger the military presence is, and the military presence involves missile defense systems. And I put defense in quotes because these defense systems can be easily changed to offense, and they can deliver nuclear payloads and hit Russia. So if you're in a strategic game of controlling resources and having your sphere of influence and containing Russia, because the United States, it's not in their interest to have like the Nord Stream pipeline between Russia and Germany, which is probably what's part of what's involved here, that Germany and Russia are developing closer ties. You can't have that if you're the United States, because you want to control, micromanage everything, and you want to make sure that Russia and Germany can't become too closely aligned, France and whatever other countries they can, because they start forming economic partnerships. Next thing you know, if shit goes down, they can become allies. So that's strategically, that's a big no-no for the U.S., and we are the world's police. So it's in our interest to have more countries expand into NATO, especially Ukraine, because we can go in there and put our defense systems. Next thing you know, it's a checkmate. It's a checkmate against Russia, because in any conflict in the future, we already have them. I mean, we're practically surrounding them already. Now, if we start putting military installations in Ukraine, it's game over for them. That they have absolutely no way to get out of our stranglehold that we have on them. So that you can see why Russia would say that this is our red line. You can't have Ukraine join NATO. And now I can see why the Ukrainians would be pissed off at this, because it's like, well, who the hell is Russia to say we can't join NATO? But unfortunately for Ukraine, they're stuck in a power struggle. And there's Ukrainians that want to join NATO. There's Ukrainians that are more pro-Russian, but they are in the struggle, no different than Vietnam was a proxy for conflict between Russia or the USSR and the United States. No different than other countries that found themselves, like Latin American countries as well, were proxies for these bigger actors fighting each other. This is the same situation for Ukraine. But you can't say that it's Russia that's being aggressive here, because it's in NATO's interest to keep putting more military bases next to Russia so we can control them, so we can dictate to them what they should do with their economic policy, what they should do with their resources, like pretty much, empire building, right? So we want to have a say. We want to micromanage them as well. And we can't right now because of Putin.
I'm trying to process everything you've shared. First of all,
little long-winded there, sorry.
Russia is a huge country, huge territory that has influence in other parts. And I think when you look at a map, it's pretty amazing to me how little Europe, the western side, is compared to Russia. And then you also have China, that I know they're allies, in some ways balancing some of the other superpowers that, in the U.S. mainly, that you mentioned. At the same time, I do see, and I'm probably ashamed to say this now, but realizing how close Moscow is to Europe in some ways, right? So the fact that Ukraine is within striking distance, but so are so many of the other countries around there. So I can also understand why, where they're coming from.
I mean,
that said, it's like it's. I mean, but Russia can be a strong country, China can be a strong country, but doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be under an authoritarian regime. And I know that's the reality of the models before us. You either have, the American model, or you have the Asian Chinese model, and there seems to be no in between.
Right, but they should be able to have whatever model they want, right?
They should, of course, but I think that, I think this is where it gets to Are we? Is it that we are imposing, we as U.S. imposing democracy and our values on different countries, or is it just that it has been proven that when you let people vote, when you are not oppressing religious minorities or ethnic minorities, which, and again, and I think as I say all those things, I know that those are things that have happened and continue to happen in Western countries too. So I guess bottom line, estamos jodidos.
Yeah, well, we do a lot under the guise of spreading democracy and spreading freedom because we've supported a lot of dictators, and that's just a way for us to go in there and remove whatever government might be in power and install one that's favorable to us. And we could use the repression of the minority, the Uyghurs in China. We can use the repression of, say, specific marginalized groups in Russia, like gays and so forth. But look, honestly, if another country wanted to, if they have if they had the leverage, if they had the power to try to pull this off, and all they had to do was convince their population that it's worth doing it, they would try to invade the U.S. and say that the U.S. is repressing Native Americans and Black people. It's a human right. They could make it a human rights issue. And from the point of view of those citizens in those other countries, it would sound reasonable. Oh, look at what the United States does to Black people. It incarcerates a huge percentage of them compared to their overall population of the country. Look at what it does to Native Americans, having them living in reservations in perpetual poverty. I mean, if you do the messaging that way, then you can convince a population to like do anything. That's why I say that it's very dangerous when we give our government the power to use the guise of democracy to go and intervene in somebody else's affairs, because they'll exploit it, just like they did in Iraq and in Syria, in Libya, in like Central America, and they'll keep exploiting it. So we just have to be more reluctant to give them that power. But when it comes to Russia and whether or not, to your original question, are we going to go to war? It's in no one's interest except maybe the U.S. and some of the European countries, maybe to start a diversion. I mean, the U.S. economy is not doing so well. We have a lot of high inflation. This could be a good way to take some of the attention away from that and use it as a justification for enacting certain economic policies at home. It's not in Russia's interest to start a war. They don't want to start a war. If anything, we want to push them towards war. The reason why Russia and China are not interested in starting a war, and the only reason why they would start a war is if we actually catch them in, like if we are able to effectively trap them, is that Russia and China just have to keep waiting. All they have to do is keep waiting. Because the United States and Western Europe, it's like these capitalist countries are eating themselves. We keep going more and more into debt. Our military, it's overextended. So the more China and Russia just mind their own affairs and mind their own like regional sphere of influence, it's just a waiting game for them.
Yeah, I mean, they're still, maybe they're not as powerful as they once were, but they're certainly formidable opponents. And I think some of the same pro-war forces that are at play here in the U.S. also are at play in Russia and China and other parts, right? Because there's nothing that gets the economy going. There's nothing that gets the folks in your country going than having an enemy and mobilizing for that type of endeavor. But yes, I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail. That this is just a moment of Russia flexing. Flexing is its muscles and also showing NATO that they're ready to defend themselves as well. So I'm just hoping that we don't get to that situation, because I think the problem is whether or not that moment happens intentionally or unintentionally, of something happens and there's a potential for somebody, a third party, to say, okay, this is a combustible situation, let's just tiremos una bomba and then let's get these folks to go at it, and then nobody wins. I mean, some people would win, but I think if it gets down to a war like that, it's really not gonna be a good. I think let's hope that, 2020 brought us COVID, 2021 brought us Omicron. Let's hope that
Hmm.
2022 doesn't bring
Yeah, and
this
and
horrible situation.
yeah, and also let's just think about what Russia's demands are. So Ukraine can have Ukraine join NATO, and also bring down some of those military installations in some of these other countries. So that's a de-escalation of firepower, and also, like as we mentioned earlier, Ukraine joining NATO is an escalation because NATO will move its missile defense systems and other assets into Ukraine, closer to Russia. So that escalates things. So if anything, Ukraine not joining NATO it means that you won't have more escalation. So then who's the one that's ignoring that request and who's the one that wants to push for that, which is pushing for higher escalation. So yeah, it's like I said, it's I try to just take an objective view to it. I don't try to paint some actors as benevolent and others as not. It's just different parties with different interests. And right now, one of those parties has a bigger gun than the other, so it gets to do more. But ultimately, it's just different actors, different agents, different interests, and they're all trying to maneuver within whatever they can get away with. So, unfortunately for Ukraine, they're stuck in the middle of this.
True. And I think the fact that either way, what's happening also gets played at the domestic level as we think about the midterms elections. And I think, yes, maybe there's a desire for President Biden not to be seen as weak, but then there's also a an incentive from the opposition party to make him seem that way, and then obviously impact the balance of power back home.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we'll keep an eye on this one. So I think we can wrap it up here. For those of you out there, if you enjoy our content, make sure to check us out. We are Brown Perspective. Estamos on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Nos vemos.
Ciao.